In 1955, a working family of four spent about $30 a week on groceries. That was not a lot of money then, and it sounds like almost nothing now, but it had to cover everything. 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 4 people at the table every evening at 6. The woman who made that work was not performing a miracle. She was doing what her mother had done, and what her mother's mother had done before that. She had learned how to feed people well on almost nothing, and she did it so quietly and so consistently that most of the people who sat at her table never once thought to ask how. The meals she made on that budget were not the kind that appear in cookbooks with photographs. They were the kind that appear in memories, the ones that hit you the moment you open the back door after school, that taste exactly like a Tuesday evening in February, that cost almost nothing and filled you completely, and that most American households stopped making around 1965 and have not made since. Here is what was on that table. The bean soup started on Sunday night, quietly, with no announcement. The ham bone from Sunday dinner went into a large pot of cold water, whatever meat was still on it, whatever scraps were clinging to the joint, along with a pound of dried navy beans that had been soaking in a bowl on the counter since Saturday afternoon. Your grandmother set the pot on the back burner at the lowest heat the stove would hold and walked away from it. By the time Monday morning came, and the house was cold, and the day had not properly started yet, that pot had been working for 10 hours, and the kitchen smelled like something deep and warm and slow that you could feel before you were fully awake. Bean soup with a ham bone is not a complicated thing. The ham gives the beans a smokiness that nothing else quite replaces, and the long overnight heat gives them a creaminess that any amount of short cooking never produces. Your grandmother added an onion, a bay leaf, and held the salt until near the end, because salt added too early tightens the beans and keeps them from softening, and she knew this the way she knew everything in that kitchen, from years of paying attention. By noon on Monday, the soup was ready, and it was better than anything that came out of a can, and it cost roughly 20 cents in additional ingredients because the bone and the beans were already accounted for. The pot was empty by Tuesday. Not a spoonful remained. Wednesday evenings often brought what your grandmother called creamed chipped beef, and what the men who had eaten it in the military referred to by a considerably less polite name that became famous enough to appear in a movie decades later. Chipped beef was dried, salted beef that came in a small glass jar for about 30 cents. You rinsed it before using it. This was not optional, because without rinsing it was so salty it was nearly inedible, and then tore it into rough pieces and cooked it briefly in butter until the edges curled. Then came the white sauce. Butter and flour stirred together over medium heat until smooth. Then milk added slowly and stirred until the whole thing thickened into something creamy and pale. The chipped beef went back in. The sauce went over toast. That was the meal, and it sounds like less than it was. The white sauce done right, not too thick, not too thin, the beef distributed evenly through it, was genuinely satisfying in the way that simple things done well always are. The toast soaked up the sauce from below. The beef had a concentrated, salty intensity that plain cooked meat does not have. The whole dinner took about 15 minutes from the moment your grandmother turned on the burner to the moment it hit the table, and it cost less than 50 cents for 4 people. Your grandfather had eaten this in the Navy and had mixed feelings about it. Your grandmother made it better than the Navy had, which was admittedly not a high standard to clear. He ate it every Wednesday, it appeared, without complaint, and he never once asked her to stop making it. The potato soup came out on the coldest evenings of January, the ones when the wind came off the open fields and found every gap in the window frames, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house by a distance that was not close. Potatoes cost about 3 cents a pound in 1955. Your grandmother used 4 or 5 medium ones, peeled and cut into rough cubes, cooked in just enough water to cover them until they were soft. Then she mashed some of them against the side of the pot and left the rest in pieces, because the combination of both, some smooth, some still holding their shape, gave the soup a texture that was more interesting than either mashed potatoes or plain potato soup by itself. Milk went in slowly, stirred over low heat so it would not scorch. A generous amount of butter, salt and pepper, sometimes a small diced onion that had been cooked soft in butter before the potatoes went in. That was everything. What came out of that pot was the definition of what comfort food actually is. Before that phrase got attached to expensive dishes in restaurants designed to make people feel something they would otherwise have to pay a therapist to feel. Real comfort food is food that is warm and filling and costs almost nothing and tastes like someone cared whether you were cold when you sat down. Your grandmother's potato soup tasted exactly like that. A pot of it cost about 30 cents in ingredients and fed 4 people dinner with enough left over for lunch the next day, and anyone who reheated a bowl of it on a Thursday afternoon in February and did not feel something specific and good was simply not paying attention. Thursday was the night for meatloaf, and the meatloaf your grandmother made was not the kind you find in restaurants today. It was denser, bigger, and considerably more economical, because the point was never to showcase the beef. The point was to make 1 pound of ground beef, which cost about 40 cents, feed 4 people a full dinner, and still have enough left over for sandwiches on Friday. She stretched that pound of beef with breadcrumbs that had been soaked in milk until soft, which added bulk and kept the loaf moist through an hour in the oven without drying out. A diced onion went in, and an egg to hold everything together, and salt and pepper, and sometimes a tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce that disappeared into the mixture and left behind only a depth of flavor you could not quite identify. The top got a stripe of ketchup down the center that caramelized in the oven into something sticky and slightly sweet and slightly charred at the edges. The loaf went into a pan at 350 degrees and stayed there for an hour, and it came out firm enough to slice cleanly with a kitchen knife, which was essential because clean slices were what made Friday's sandwiches work. The cold meatloaf sandwich was, in the opinion of many people who grew up eating both, better than the Thursday dinner had been. Cold meatloaf on white bread with a thin spread of mustard and a slice of raw onion was one of those combinations that consistently and quietly exceeds what it has any right to be. Your grandmother knew this. She made the loaf on Thursday specifically so there would be sandwiches on Friday, and the sandwiches were the reason she made it as large as she did. Salt pork and gravy appeared on Friday evenings in many American homes of the 1950s, particularly across the Midwest and the South, where this dish had been feeding families through hard seasons for the better part of 100 years before your grandmother took her turn at it. Salt pork was a cut of pork cured in salt, inexpensive, dense, and intensely flavored, in a way that made a little go a long way. You sliced it thin and soaked it in cold water for an hour to pull out some of the salt, then dried it and laid it into a hot cast-iron skillet where it crisped up on both sides and rendered out a considerable amount of fat. The fat that remained in the pan, dark and fragrant and slightly smoky from the pork, became the base for the gravy. Flour went in first and cooked briefly until it smelled faintly toasty, and then milk went in slowly, and the whole thing was stirred over medium heat until it thickened into something pourable and rich. The gravy went over the pork and over whatever was on the plate beside it, biscuits or bread or boiled potatoes, depending on what the week had left to offer. The whole dinner cost about 20 cents. Salt pork was not considered a prestigious cut of meat in 1955, and the women who cooked it were not under the impression that they were feeding their families luxury food. They were feeding their families Friday dinner with what Friday had available, and the people at the table ate it and were satisfied, and the next morning the cast-iron skillet had been wiped clean and put back on the stove where it belonged. Saturday meant baked beans, and baked beans meant the beans had been soaking since Friday night, which meant your grandmother had planned this one day ahead of time the same way she planned everything, Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just steadily and without fuss. Navy beans or Great Northern beans, depending on what was in the pantry, went into a heavy pot or a bean crock with a piece of salt pork or a few strips of bacon, a diced onion, a spoonful of dry mustard, a couple of tablespoons of brown sugar, a tablespoon of molasses, and enough water to cover everything by an inch. The lid went on, and the pot went into a low oven, about 250 degrees, first thing Saturday morning, and it stayed there until late afternoon. 6 hours, sometimes 7. The molasses gave the beans a dark color and a slight bitterness that balanced the sweetness. The long, slow heat gave the beans a creaminess inside their skins that no quick-cooked bean ever develops, no matter how long you cook it at higher heat. Saturday night baked beans in New England traditionally came with brown bread, a dense, dark, slightly sweet bread made with cornmeal and rye flour and blackstrap molasses, steamed in a can on the stovetop rather than baked in the oven, which produced a texture unlike anything else in American cooking. Cut into rounds, buttered while still warm, eaten alongside the beans. The combination was one of those meals that sounds modest and delivers something much larger. It cost about 30 cents for a family dinner and left most people at the table feeling more satisfied than dinners that cost 10 times as much. And then there was the dinner that appeared when the week had run out before the money had fully arrived, the one your grandmother put on the table without hesitation and without apology, because there was no time for either. Scrambled eggs, whatever was in the house alongside them, a few slices of onion cooked soft in butter before the eggs went in, leftover potatoes diced and fried in the skillet until they crisped on the outside, bread toasted on the side. If there was a small amount of cheese, it went into the eggs at the last moment. If there was not, the eggs were good without it. A dozen eggs cost about 60 cents in 1955, and a dinner of scrambled eggs with toast for 4 people came to less than 20 cents all in. It was not the dinner anyone would have requested, but it was hot, it was ready at 6 o'clock, and it was on the table. Your grandmother put it down and called everyone in, and that was the whole conversation about it. The family ate, and the kitchen cleaned up fast because there was very little to clean, and the next morning the routine started over from the beginning. Here is the bigger thing underneath all of it. These meals were not made by women who had run out of ideas. They were made by women who had a very clear idea of what they were doing and why. Feeding 4 people on $30 a week required knowledge that did not come from a cookbook and could not be replaced by a convenience food from a package. It required knowing how long beans needed to soak, how to build a white sauce that did not break, how to read a pot of potato soup by its smell and its texture rather than by a timer. It required knowing that cold meatloaf on bread was worth making the meatloaf for, and that the ham bone from Sunday dinner was not garbage, but the beginning of Monday's meal. The supermarket and the freezer section and the TV dinner made all of this seem unnecessary, and in a certain sense they did make it unnecessary. You could open a can of soup and heat it on the stove in 5 minutes, and the family would eat. But what went away in that exchange was the specific knowledge of how to cook something good from almost nothing, built and refined and passed from one generation of American women to the next, for as long as there had been American households that needed to eat well on what they had. That knowledge is not entirely gone, but it is quiet now and hard to find, and most of the women who carried it in their hands and their kitchens are gone too. Your grandmother put dinner on the table at 6 o'clock every evening of her married life. Not always the dinner anyone would have chosen. Always the dinner that was there. Memory Lane, America. One story at a time.